Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, and welcome to today's Just webinar, Fireside Chat with Vungle, Best Practices on Leveraging Your User Data. My name is Kevin, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Adjust. I'd like to start off by introducing our two speakers of the day. First, we're welcoming Rena. Rena is a prominent member of our integrations team here at Adjust. And alongside Rena, we're also welcoming Maurice. Maurice is heading up the performance optimization team at Vungle. Thank you both for joining today. So before we start, a few housekeeping rules. So this webinar is scheduled to last about 30 minutes. For those of you new to GoToWebinar, you should see a panel on a side of your screen. You can use this panel to ask any question you would like throughout the presentation, and our speakers will address them at the end of the session. Finally, the recording of this presentation, as well as the slides, will be shared with all of you via email. All the people who registered will get that email. So on the agenda today, we will briefly introduce the topic as well as give you a little bit of information on Adjust in Vungle. We'll then dive right in, taking a closer look at LTV optimization, view-thru attribution, and fraud before moving on to a formal Q&A for the last couple of minutes. So without further ado, let's start with a little bit of context in regards to why this conversation actually matters. There really are three aspects as to why leveraging your user data is important. First, the amount of smartphones worldwide is obviously growing. In fact, the Smart Insights 2017 study projects the number of smartphones users to pass the 2.5 billion mark by 2019. So smartphone is one thing, but what about the amount of data per smartphone? Well, 2017 Ericsson Mobility Report suggests that the amount of data per smartphone per month will increase by 528% from 2015 to 2021. So that's considerable. And this is really important for app developers and marketers, considering we currently know that 90% of the time spent on mobile is spent on apps. So with that in mind, I'll directly hand it over to Rena and Maurice, who will briefly present Just in Vungle before diving into today's topic. Rena, the floor is all yours.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So to quickly introduce Adjust to everyone, if you go to the next slide, Adjust has been around since 2012, and we celebrated our 5-year anniversary last month. Since day one, our goal has been to simplify the mobile ecosystem. With so many different advertising channels and ways to measure engagement, it can be very overwhelming. Our analytics tool enables marketers to measure, attribute, and analyze their mobile advertising campaigns. To date, we've been ranked the #1 mobile attribution SDK used in the top iOS apps. We've been integrated over 14,000 times, have over 150 employees over 14 global offices. We track over 100 billion data points, or 2 petabytes of traffic a month, which is a ton of data to wrap your head around. We also happen to be integrated with over 800 partners, which is why we can make this measurement and attribution so easy. So now I'll pass it off to Maurice.
Thanks, Rena, and thanks, Kevin, for having me today. So similar to Adjust, actually, we at Vungle just recently celebrated our 5th birthday. Since day one, we've focused on in-app video. I think that's one of the things that's allowed us to stay focused, scale to over 2.5 billion monthly video views, and recently announced an annualized run rate of $300 million. We were also recently ranked #1 for cross-platform user retention globally. Now, as head of performance optimization, I'd love to take credit for that. But there's a lot that goes into providing great quality. We're going to talk a bit more about LTV optimization today, but it's certainly important to remember that without kind of an engaging ad experience, we're not really going to get near the users that our developers want. Vungle is obviously well known for some of the most innovative creative formats in the market, which frankly makes my job quite a bit easier. Back to you, Rena.
All right, so let's kick off this Q&A with the topic of LTV optimization. So LTV stands for lifetime value and is a measurement of how much each user is worth, and it allows advertisers to decide how much money they can spend on each user. Advertisers can do their LTV analysis on the Adjust dashboard, as we provide cohorted analysis on various LTV measures such as retention and revenue data. And you can see on the next slide that on the left side, you'll see the various networks that you're running your campaigns on. And on the top, you'll see the various LTV measures. These are just some examples, but you can look at retention rate, or LTV, or total revenue, and it's split across different cohorts. And cohort here is defined by how many days it has passed since the user has installed the app. We also have Vungle leverage our campaign, ad group, and creative parameters so that advertisers can easily see which publisher or creative is driving the best quality users. So Maurice, I've briefly touched upon how an advertiser might run LTV analysis on our dashboard. Could you talk about how it might be important for Vungle to also do LTV optimization?
Yeah, sure. So good question. I think the first answer to that question is probably pretty well described in the slide here. I think this is a pretty typical look for, sorry, actually your previous slide, your slide. This is actually a pretty typical look for a developer or a UA buyer. A number of different networks, maybe between even 5 and 10 different platforms. And independent of the level, and obviously Adjust offers a very granular level of reporting, it's a lot to manage. And at Vungle, we like to be proactive. So we want developers to hit their goals, whether it's scale or retention or ROAS. We really want to make sure that they see return. Some buyers have very intelligent BI systems in addition to the Adjust reporting. But even then, some of those tools can lack kind of vital pieces of Vungle specific information that really no one but Vungle has access to. So in the next slide, I give a bit of an example of what this type of information might be. And this is just one example among many. So for those of you that buy from Vungle, you'll know that we allocate views to developers or buyers based on a combination of the cost per install that the developer's paying and also the conversion rate or the average conversion rate of their campaigns. So that's basically an effective CPM. Excuse me. So let's imagine a developer has identified a single publisher who provides quality installs, and they could do that through the Adjust reporting dashboard. We're using the ad group parameter and the creative parameter. It's very easy for someone to say, okay, Vungle is providing from this publisher a very high amount of return for the one I'm paying. Now, typically the CPI that the developer uses will be based on that return. You're not going to have a CPI much higher than the return that you're getting from those installs. So they're pretty much directly proportional. So you can imagine that you've kind of identified this source and you've set a static CPI based on the average quality that you see or the average return that you see. Now, the plot on the right is, it basically shows why this might not be the best solution. But you wouldn't know that. It shows the average conversion rate, that's the gray line, and the average 7-day return on ad spend, so the amount of revenue you get within 7 days of install. Those are the green bars, and that's as a function of the daily view number within this publisher. So the daily view number is how many views a user has seen within 1 day. And you can essentially see that the fewer views a user has seen, the more likely they are to convert, the more likely they are to download the app that's being advertised, but also the more likely they are to provide a higher return. Now this means, and this is where the crux comes in, this means that if you're getting a lot of second or third views, you're being allocated those both, based on your effective CPM or your CPI and conversion rate combination, then you wouldn't know that if you increased your bid, you'd see both more installs and a higher return on ad spend, actually allowing you to sustain that higher bid. And it works in the opposite way too. So if you were getting the majority of the first views available in this publisher, you wouldn't know that by increasing your CPI that you actually probably wouldn't get that many more impressions, and you also wouldn't see greater return. So that's the type of thing that we can layer on top of the typical reporting that a developer sees.
Gotcha. So there's quite a bit of insight that Vungle can provide and can recommend in terms of, hey, you guys don't have first view. Here's are some of our recommendations.
Exactly.
Cool. So at Adjust, we send a bunch of data to your servers. Could you talk a little bit more about what you do with those data points? Those can include install, session, reattributions, and event data.
Exactly, yeah. So I've spent some time visualizing this on the next slide. And in the outset, it's not actually that different to Adjust. So the way that you communicate with our server is obviously via the module or via URL callbacks. They call our API and basically send us a constant stream of event information. The first thing we do is ingest that and process that information. We link it back to the original install and therefore the original view, the original session, which essentially layers a lot of information on top of that single event. The next thing we'll do is we'll want to understand what are the client's KPIs or goals. Maybe it's a 5% 7-day return on ad spend, maybe it's a, I don't know, 20% day 3 retention. It varies pretty wildly. But it allows us to know what we should be aiming for. Now, once we have the client goals or KPIs, we're kind of free to try and make sure that they're hitting those goals and maximizing their install volume. And we can do that one of two ways or using both. So either we can use our automated bidder tool. That's a kind of a low-touch tool that's based on, built by our data science team actually, based on historical data to try and choose the best CPI for a certain cohort of users based off the KPI or goal that the client has given us. Alternatively, we can kind of do a fully managed service, and that's where my team come in predominantly. You know, a global team of experienced kind of optimization managers, understanding how they can change campaign structures, what publishers they should move, what bids they should change in order to reach the same goal, really, and that's maximizing install volume for the same and hitting the target KPI. And finally, we can maybe do a bit of both, where we'll use the auto bidder and then layer on those kind of insights that I mentioned earlier. The next step is it's kind of separate to that, and it's creative optimization. So we have an in-house creative team based in London. They do a lot of innovation, create a lot of dynamic templates that we can use for all of our different advertisers. And what we can use the post-install data for is to really understand that creative not only on kind of a conversion rate level, but also whether it's providing value on a kind of ROAS level or retention level. Yeah, and then finally we produce reporting that's quite similar to Adjust really, but maybe a little more tailored. A lot of our advertisers, we want to tailor the reporting over a long period of time, or we want to give a picture of how their KPIs are being met at certain times or throughout a quarter, for example. And having that data fed in via Adjust makes it a lot easier to do that.
So you mentioned earlier about how clients set different KPIs. Could you talk a little bit more about what different targets you typically see from advertisers?
Sure thing. Yeah, so it really depends on how, I think most predominantly how the developer monetizes. So we work with a range of different developers, from pure brands to some gaming specific or brand performance, or lots of different types of applications. Obviously, we're only speaking about the kind of pure performance world right now, which predominantly buy on a CPI basis. But yeah, really the goals depend very much on how the app monetizes. So the majority of developers are probably looking at return on ad spend. To make that a sensible metric for performance, a large portion of your revenue stream has to come through some kind of revenue event, typically an in-app purchase. You can imagine that a lot of apps have in-app purchases their predominant revenue stream. Alternatively, there are some developers who look more towards retention, and that might be because they have goals on building a community in their app, or alternatively, they monetize a lot through advertisement. So they need people in their application to kind of filter to feed their revenue stream. And then there's a kind of a different portion, which is more typical for the performance brands as we see them. So, and that's where an in-app purchase might not best describe the way that they make revenue. And instead, maybe a cost per action, cost per active user, or an event completion, something like that might make more sense. A good example is an app that's a marketplace, so it allows buying and selling between individuals, and they might monetize through taking a percentage of that buying and selling interaction. Therefore, looking at any single purchase doesn't really make sense because they can vary wildly in price, whereas seeing if someone makes a purchase or makes that first purchase could be a better signal. And then finally, there are people who blend one or two of them, or maybe all three. Typically, blending return on ad spend and retention is most common.
Gotcha. So it really depends on the advertiser's monetization strategy. So there's no really blanket goal for everyone.
Exactly, yeah. And I think people are still, it changes over time too. I mean, typically an app launch would have different goals as someone trying to sustain their application. And, those goals can vary quite wildly. So that's where, receiving the data from Adjust in a constant way allows us to be dynamic.
Gotcha, interesting. Okay, so we're going to hop on over to our next topic. Our next topic is view-thru attribution. For those of you who aren't familiar with view-thru attribution, I'll talk briefly about how it works. Traditionally, the ad that drove the last click for a user before they installed the app is the ad that the install is attributed to. Here at Adjust, we also have an option for advertisers to not only attribute installs based on last click, but also by last view. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that in our reporting, you'll be able to analyze the users based on the type of attribution. So you'll see that you'll be able to select click or impression or both click and impression. So Maurice, maybe we can talk about how you and Vungle view view-thru attribution. It can be a controversial topic because people have various opinions on it, partly because if they only use click-through attribution, those users would have been considered organic, but would love to hear about how you guys see it.
Yeah, for sure. I think I've actually, on the next slide, I've visualized kind of the view-thru attribution steps. And now what I've done is I've kind of visualized this to make a point, actually. So part one visualizes typical click-through attribution. User views an ad or video in Vungle's case. They click, they're redirected to the store, and they install. As long as they do that within the attribution window, which I've put 7 days for here for a typical click attribution window, then the install is attributed to Vungle as long as there's no other last click from another platform. And then part two is a visualization of view-thru attribution, where there's a view but no click. The user returns to the application that they were in originally, navigates to the store kind of on their own autonomously, and then they install, but as long as they do that within 24 hours, pretty typical window for view-thru attribution, then Vungle gets the install too. And as you said, kind of last click and last view affect whether Vungle would actually get that installed, but in this example, I'm assuming no other platform is running. A beautiful world. So I've kind of put this in there for two reasons. So historically, as you said, the discussions that I've had around view-thru attribution are around whether a view signifies enough of an engagement to warrant an install being attributed to it. Now, for typical kind of banner advertising, I think that's very questionable indeed, especially on a mobile device where the screen is a lot smaller. I can't see how a view would signify an engagement. Now, for video, I would argue it's slightly different, especially for rewarded video. I think it's much harder to say there was no engagement at all there. However, I think it is something that buyers should be extremely careful of and treat with care. And actually, the more organics that you have, or the larger in the ecosystem that you are, the more susceptible you are to paying for organics if view-thru is misused. So here's where this diagram comes in. So typically the view-thru window is 24 hours. Now I think any further than that, then we've examined it at Vungle, then you are pretty much just paying for organic users. So as long as you use the attribution sensibly and you trust the partner, the video partner in this case, and you know that the ad experience is an engaging one, then I think it can be a very powerful tool. But it is something I would encourage all developers to treat very, very carefully.
Gotcha. So you mean here that they should really figure out at what point clicks are being fired and impressions are being fired? Is that what you're kind of touching on here?
So yeah, I think that's one case for sure. Yeah, obviously clicks and views are very important to be fired at the right time. You know, a view with a completed view versus a view of the start of a video is a very different thing. I think those are the things that you should know if you're running view-thru.
Gotcha.
And attribution windows are something that should be considered very closely. But yeah, in general, I would say video is a much more naturally engaging format. So I wouldn't consider view-thru for a non-video ad.
Gotcha. And then could you also talk a little bit about what kind of effects you see in UA uplift when an advertiser turns on view-thru attribution?
Yeah, so yeah, I think we've obviously talked about this a bit. So I think there's two ways to look at it. One, you can look at, okay, do I want to determine whether a view is an engagement or not, and then base my decision on that. But also from a different angle, the effects of a view-thru attribution on your advertising campaigns can be pretty stark. So on the next slide, I've put a plot that basically shows typically what can happen when a developer turns on view-thru attribution. So this plot shows install numbers as the bars. Green are click-through installs, and gray are view-thru installs. And the blue line is just the number of views that get allocated to that campaign by Vungle. For the first 7 days, this example developer is running normal click-through attribution and getting allocated a decent number of views. On day 7, they turn on view-through attribution. And this is with typical Windows, 7-day click, 24-hour view. And you can see instantaneously they start to get view-through installs. Basically what has happened there is they've chosen to move installs that would be previously allocated to organic, now allocated to Vungle. One, because they believe the engagement is there from the video view, and two, maybe they actually want more information about those installs and what path the user came down. But the effect on the campaign is pretty dramatic. So overall, what we see is that the overall conversion rate will increase dramatically. So normally we see when view-thru gets turned on between 5 to 20% extra installs overall. That's the click plus the view installs. What that means is the conversion rate of the campaign goes up. It's the same number of views, it's more installs. Because Vungle allocates views based on a CPI and conversion rate combination, and the CPI hasn't changed here, it means that overall, Vungle will now start to allocate a lot more views to this campaign. Now, that may not change things. Well, it does change things, but it's not so obvious what it's changing. But overall, what we see is not only do then view-thru installs go up, but click-through installs go up. So what you do is you turn on view-thru attribution, you get more installs overall, but you're also getting more click installs and not just view installs. Which this is the calculation that an advertiser has to make, is whether those extra click installs and the return on ad spend or the retention or the added volume that you get from making that change outweighs the cost of now paying for installs that were organic. So it's a difficult calculation, in summary.
Got it. So basically, the view-thru attributed installs are added on, but in addition to that, because that increases the conversion rate, you'll also see an increase in click-through installs as well.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's hop on over to our last topic, fraud prevention and detection. For those of you who are familiar with the Adjust product may already know that fraud prevention is a huge initiative for us. One of our main differentiators is that when we detect fraud, we actually don't send install callbacks to networks, hence our naming convention, fraud prevention. We currently have 3 filters, anonymous IP filtering, too many engagements, and distribution outlier. And you'll see on the next slide that you can see all of this in our reporting. On the left side, you'll see the various networks, and then across the columns, you'll see the 3 different filters, and you'll be able to see which fraud is occurring for which networks. So our goal here is that we want to save time for advertisers and networks so that they don't have to realign numbers after the fact. So Maurice, maybe it would be awesome if you could talk a little bit about your experience with the Adjust Fraud Prevention Suite and how that may have affected your relationship with advertisers.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is quite an exciting one for us. So, I mean, given we have kind of direct SDK relationships with all of our publishers, relatively we see very little fraud. However, that very small amount of fraud can lead to a lot of communication with our developers. A lot of back and forth. It can affect even things up to kind of invoicing, financing, cash flow, things like that. But the great thing about the Adjust tool is that really it's changed very little in terms of the relationship that we have with our advertisers, because it just happens in the background. And that's predominantly because we don't get install callbacks that are fraudulent. So anything deemed fraudulent, we don't receive it as a callback, and therefore we don't pay a fraudulent publisher mistakenly via that install. And really it cuts off fraud at the source. And actually, this is my sort of hope on hope. If everyone in the marketplace as a developer used this tool, then I think fraud would pretty much be obliterated at the source. Because what these fraudulent publishers rely on is that things slipping through the cracks and not being caught by either the platform or the attribution provider. In addition to that, it prevents the back and forth. If someone knows that fraud is happening via their attribution tool, but it's not prevented going to the platform via the callback, then essentially you're saying, oh, this is happening, but I'm going to pay for it in advance and then expect a refund a month later, which is exactly what happens outside of the Adjust tool, which is fine overall, but it can cause a lot of back and forth, and it can damage relationships with advertisers, to be honest.
Totally. I'll also add that there's new types of fraud showing up day in, day out, and so at Adjust we're constantly doing research on what new types of fraud that might be out there, and we may add, we will add new filters in the future. In addition, we are able to send what we call rejected install callbacks to networks, and we do that for Vungle right now. Could you talk about what the benefit of Adjust sending rejected install callbacks?
Yeah, for sure. So, well, because not everyone is on this tool in the buying community, it means that there are people still buying and sending callbacks for fraudulent installs. So, as an ad platform, we proactively seek out, a number of different data points that allow us to understand whether a publisher is fraudulent and whether we need to kind of cut the relationship with that source. And by receiving the fraud reason via or rejection reason via Adjust, it's another data point for us. So it allows us to be proactive in preventing fraud while Adjust still prevent those fraudulent callbacks from getting to us. So it's a perfect situation in terms of we don't get the callback, but we also get the information which helps us to stop fraud for the rest of the kind of ecosystem.
Great, that's really great to hear. And And lastly, I'd love to hear from your perspective, what types of fraud you see as prevalent in the market?
Sure. Yeah, so I visualized this one really briefly. I think these aren't actually what we see on Vungle all of the time, but these are, I would say, the most common or well-known in at least from my point of view in the market. So I would say they kind of fall into four buckets. The first is, or maybe three buckets. The first is false install generation. That's, you know, farms and things like that, or bots, and those for us at least are relatively easy to catch. They call, you know, we can do it via the post-install data that you send us and understand, okay, these installs or this source across the board is providing zero retention or only ever provides retention up to day 3 and then it's nothing forever. And we're pretty good at catching those. But they're definitely still out there, and we have seen an increase probably over the last 6 months. The next, I would say, one of the most prevalent we see is click stuffing. And I put click injection in that bucket too. So that's essentially spamming attribution providers like yourselves with clicks in the hope of being allocated an install. And that's where the real kind of professional fraudsters come in, where they'll kind of mix real ad experiences, real apps with this click stuffing or click injection. And that can be much harder to detect, and I think actually has much more scale behind it. So that's the really scary one. And then finally, something that's, I hope, relatively well known in the industry is click on view. So unfortunately, this is a fairly widespread practice. And it comes from ad platforms or networks like ourselves, not that we do it, but like ourselves, acting, I would say, either obliviously or incorrectly, and firing clicks or click URLs to attribution providers like yourselves when only a view or a completed view has happened. So it's pretty equivalent to click stuffing in that you're firing as many clicks as possible in order to try and get some kind of misattribution. And overall, I think this could also be one of the largest causes of misattribution that we have out there, and is somewhat overlooked because, generally because of the way the advertising community buys. I think as a UA buyer, you may only be focused on a couple of ad platforms. Therefore, you're very focused on the install volume, and you don't maybe have such a big picture on kind of the number of organics or how that's fluctuating when you turn on and off certain ad platforms. Now, this isn't true of every developer out there. I'm sure of it. I have had a lot of conversations with our developers, and there are some really, really intelligent developers out there and buyers who are fully aware of all three of these, actually.
Cool, yeah, so these are many of the fraud types that we also see from the Adjust side as well. And I guess I'll throw in a shameless plug in here too, that the install generation that you talked about is actually filtered out by the anonymous IP filtering, and things that are poaching organic users through click stuffing or click on view can also be filtered by our too many engagements or distribution outlier filtering. So really great that we're on the same page here. So that
excellent. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna. That concludes our Q&A session. Maybe we can kind of broaden this to the audience here.
Yeah, Rita, Maurice, thank you so much for these insights on the three main topics: LTV, view-thru, and fraud. I hope that was very, very useful for our attendees today. We're kind of running out of time, but we can quickly move on to our formal Q&A session. Guys, I'll give it back to you.
Sure. So I see one question about view-thru attribution and how to opt into that option. I can kind of talk about the Adjust side first. So for this, 2 parts are required. So one is actually having the network send us impression data. And then the second part is actually turning on view-thru attribution through our dashboard. So you can retrieve the impression links from our dashboard to pass on to the networks, and then you can just go to our settings page in our dashboard to actually turn on the attribution type.
Nice.
And
I see another one here for me, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you recommend using the managed service or the automated bidder? Good question. This is a good question. So I would recommend using both. So with one or the other. I mean, actually, no. It depends. It depends on how much of a communication you want, how much of a high-touch relationship you want. But there are benefits of either. So the auto bidder relies on a lot more data points, and obviously, kind of the automated world has a lot more efficiency in it. On the flip side, going via a managed service, you get a lot more context and a lot more understanding about all those things that maybe can't be built into the bidder or yet to be built in there. So I would certainly go for both. Yeah, because I run the optimization team and we don't want to be replaced by an automation. I'm just joking.
Awesome. Guys, I'm going to have to unfortunately stop you there. We're definitely over time now, and I think it's time to close this up. Once again, thank you both, Maurice and Rena, and thank you to all the attendees for attending the session today. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.